nun startet unser Altmeister der Flugkunst, Ernst Udet, ein Name, den Sie alle kennen, zu Kunstflügen, die er uns mit seinem Curtis Sportdoppeldecker zeigen wird.
Welcome, dear viewers. Today I'll be reviewing this book, Ace of the Black Cross by Ernst Udet. This book is a memoir of Udet's experiences as a pilot in the Great War and post-war. Udet is a fascinating figure for many reasons. For one, he was the highest scoring German ace to survive the Great War at 62 confirmed victories. He was only surpassed in this regard by Manfred von Richthofen, the infamous Red Baron, but he died, so Udet was the highest scoring ace. In addition to this, Udet played an important role in developing the doctrine of dive bombing for Hitler's newly unveiled Luftwaffe in the mid-1930s. He was also a display pilot, frequently flying at air shows in the 1920s and the 1930s. And on a personal note, his engine-off displays remind me a lot of Bob Hoover. I enjoyed many aspects of this book, but first would be the accounts of air combat that Udet gives. While Udet writes in a dramatised tone, making the book a very enjoyable page-turner, he also shows us the real horror and omnipresent dangers of air combat, which do keep his memoirs grounded in reality. It annoys me a lot when narrators glorify war but gloss over the pain of human suffering, but thankfully Udet does not do that here. A particularly moving example is the death of his friend Puz, which I'll read to you now. I made a half-turn, and a moment later I saw Puz's machine enveloped in smoke and flames. Puz was sitting perfectly still, his body stiffly erect in the cockpit, his face turned towards me. He slowly raised an arm to his helmet. It might have been a last struggle, but it looked exactly as though he were saluting me for the last time. "Puz!" I shouted, "Puz!" But in that instant, his machine broke up. The engine dropped like a flaming meteor, and the broken wings fluttered after it. While on this topic, I really like the emotional depth that Udet gives to his account of things that happen throughout the book. For example, when home on leave from the front, he visits his boyhood friend Otto Bergen's house to comfort his father over the recent death of his son. While in his friend's bedroom, Udet reflects on their friendship, and here is another wonderful line. "There is something very unique about a friendship between youths. We would rather have bitten at our tongues than have said a single word which might have suggested that we were in any way fond of each other. Yet now I realized how true this was." This is just from my own personal experience and is more of an anecdote from my own life, but I really know this to be the case. For example, us men, we jokingly call each other all sorts of really nasty names in jest to distract from the fact that we care greatly about each other. However, we never, from at least from my experiences, we never get to tell each other how much we care about each other, and we never really learn to process these feelings until it's too late, as with the death of Otto Bergen, for instance, Udet's friend. While women, by contrast, they pay each other all sorts of false compliments to women who they secretly despise, and it's also in order to bully them as well. I'm smiling because I'm thinking of a certain interview with a certain actress. She shares her first name with the director of Breakfast at Tiffany's and The Great Race, and her last name is incredibly vivacious. So I'll leave it at that. Anyway, back to the book review. I also like the fact that Udet was no pushover, even when the odds were stacked against him. For example, when on a tram in November 1918, soon after the war ended, there was a somewhat contentious incident with a mobbed soldier. It was November 1918, and the day was wet and dismal. The man stared at me offensively. He was wearing a grey-green military greatcoat, a peaked cap without a regimental badge, and a broad red band round his arm. An untrimmed reddish beard covered his flabby features. He was a member of the Soldiers' Council. At length the man reached out with his hand and touched the pour le mérite, which hung at my throat. "So much old iron," he jeered. We were standing on the rear platform of an overcrowded Munich train. Other people began to take notice, curious to see what would happen next. I looked out of the window, watched the raindrops bounce on the asphalt pavement, and wondered how I would act if he were to strike me. Suddenly, a hairy paw reached for my throat and tugged at the order. "Aren't you going to take this bit of tin off?" he growled. He was much taller than I, but I had judged the distance to a nicety. Without giving him a second's warning, I seized the point of his beard between my fingers, wrenched at it with all my strength, and shouted, "Aren't you going to take your beard off?" The man roared with pain and started to hit out in all directions, striking the conductor and several of the passengers, everyone except me. In a few seconds the platform was a miniature battlefield. The conductor swung a pair of arms like coal shovels and landed a heavy blow on the other's head. The tram halted and the man in the greatcoat got out, on his ear. Picking himself up, he shook his fists at us. Fearful oaths poisoned the atmosphere. The tram continued. Two fat individuals of the profiteer type began to laugh, but I could find nothing to laugh at. Richard Overy, the historian, notes in his introduction to the book that Udet's mention of the, quote, profiteer type, close quote, shows his own personal bias as to why Germany was defeated, which segues rather nicely into my next point. The final thing which I liked about the book was the fact that it showed the callousness that returning veterans were treated with by the Weimar government. Sadly, this seems to be a recurring trend throughout history, as many veterans from Vietnam and the current conflict in Iraq can attest to. There's a wonderful saying, and it goes somewhat like this. Wars are started by politicians, fought by soldiers, won by the blood of soldiers, and victory, of course, is claimed by the politicians, who then abandon the soldiers. It's rather sad to admit, but reading between the lines, you can see Udet spiral into alcoholism to cope with the trauma of losing so many close friends. While on a trip to Argentina to sell some sports aircraft, the U-4 Flamingo primarily, Udet conjures up a rather depressing image of himself in a hotel restaurant. Eating is an art when one has little money left. My eye wandered down the prices marked on the menu. My meal cost as much money, reckoned in marks, as the German workman earned in a week. I decided on ravioli, an Italian dish with macaroni. It was the cheapest on the menu. The waiter took my humble order without batting an eyelid. It was a good hotel. But on the following day, when I again ordered ravioli, he was not so successful in concealing his astonishment. "Stomach out of order," I explained. He bowed respectfully. "Disordered stomachs are superior, empty wallets are common." I love that line. It was towards the end of July. The heat in the streets was unbearable, and the only place where it was cool and quiet was the hotel bar. I spent most of my time there, sipping a cocktail and nibbling at the little cheese biscuits which they served it with. Plenty more stood on the counter and they cost nothing. The idea was that they promoted a thirst, but in my case they took the place of an evening meal. It was only when the barman looked in my direction that I felt a little uncomfortable. From my college days, I really know that the statement about eating when poor to be an art to be very, very true. The only thing which I really disliked was the final chapter of the book, as its propaganda is seemingly straight from Goebbels' mouth. Yes, I know that memoirs are an inherently biased source of information, but this chapter looks like it was written by the Ministry of Propaganda. I'll read it out to you in its totality and you'll see why. The generation to which I belong was formed in the war. It hit us at a critical period of our lives. It left the weaker ones crushed. All that remained in them was a laming horror. But in the rest of us, and here I'll voice the opinion of the majority of old soldiers, the will to live grew harder and stronger. It was a new will to live, which considered the life of the community before the life of the individual. For 14 years we carried this realization through a strange world, a world which saw nothing great in our new belief. It desired to know nothing of soldierly values, comradeship, a sense of duty, and a spirit of sacrifice. We were strangers in its midst, and continued working for our bread. I flew in order to live, but at the same time I nourished a hope that through my work I might be contributing something to maintain German air-mindedness. I have been in many foreign parts. Wherever I went I sought men in comradeship and hearts which had not given up fate. I sought and found them, in the African jungle and in the Greenland ice. But in all of us there was a secret longing to see the spirit which inspired ourselves become a real power in the nation of which we were an inseparable part. This has happened, and I accordingly end this book. We were soldiers without a flag. We now have unfurled our flag once more. The Führer restored it to us. For old soldiers, life is again worth living. The book concludes in 1935, but let us finish the tale of Udet's life. In 1935, on the insistence of his old commander Hermann Göring, Udet was convinced into joining the Luftwaffe, newly unveiled by Hitler. Here Udet did important development work on dive bombing, including, ironically enough, in a Curtiss Hawk, which is an American plane. A quick side note, the Bf-109, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, of which I have a model here, it's made by Airfix in 1:48 scale. I don't know if the camera is picking up on it too clearly, but it's missing its radio antenna and a few details. Well, the prototype of that plane, ironically enough, actually had a Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine installed on the first prototype. Kind of ironic, really, considering that the Luftwaffe will go on to fight the British in World War II, but there you go. This series of tests in the Curtiss Hawk biplane culminated in the eventual development of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the infamous dive bomber associated with the Blitzkrieg, or Benevumskrieg, or maneuver warfare. I know the latter term is more accurate, historically accurate, but I'm including both terms, just so we're clear. Side note, the Ju-87 Stuka, I believe, is a gloriously ugly aircraft, and as a result, it's one of my favorites. The designer of the Stuka also developed the Hansa jet, which is a swept-forward business jet that was developed in the early 1960s, I believe. So that's an interesting little fact. Anyway, getting back to the story, when Udet was appointed to the head of the technical office of the ORLM, or the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, and yes, that took several tries to pronounce that correctly, or the German Air Ministry in English, he was very ill-suited for the job. My speculation is that while he was an incredible pilot, Udet had no engineering background or industry knowledge essential for this role. True, Udet's father was a mechanical engineer, and Udet did run the Udet aircraft factory in the 1920s. However, Udet served as a test and display pilot, as well as a salesman, not as an aeronautical engineer or a general manager or a production manager, for instance. Side note, the Udet aircraft factory was eventually absorbed into Messerschmitt. Anyway, but back to the story. Apologies for getting sidelined. This lack of technical knowledge really hampered Udet in his role as head of the technical office of the Reich Aviation Ministry. I believe Udet's appointment is a key example as to why promoting someone to a position based solely on charisma is a very bad idea. But in a case of failing upwards, Udet was then given responsibility for delegating all aircraft production for the Luftwaffe too. Yeah, needless to say, he was ill-suited for this additional responsibility, and as a result, he began to cope in very unhealthy ways. He slipped into a very negative cycle involving alcohol, which the less said of, the better. The end for Udet came rather tragically in November 1941. Göring and Erhard Milch turned on Udet for his failure to meet aircraft production targets, and were in general making his life a living hell. The final straw came when Udet began to hear rumours of atrocities filtering in from the Eastern Front. Disillusioned, depressed and downtrodden, Udet pulled out his .45 caliber revolver. The rest, as they say, is history. Ultimately, Udet wasn't able to conquer the demons in his life, both figuratively, such as alcohol and womanizing, and literal and the bloated form of Hermann Göring, and this is a great tragedy. For me, I choose to remember Udet not as a failure bullied by Erhard Milch and Hermann Göring into a mental breakdown. Rather, I choose to see a brave young man in his early 20s dueling over the trenches of the Western Front in World War I. In my mind, Udet's life and book, of course, are a perfect portrayal of how World War I completely destroyed a generation of young men, including those that returned from the fighting. And in modern day parlance, we would call many of these conditions post-traumatic stress disorder. I, like Udet de Guiamar, lay a belated greet on the graves of all those brave young men who risked life and limb to ultimately fight and die for nothing of value to be gained. At best, a few yards of bloody no man's land. Thank you very, very much for watching this video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. I'll close this video on a more positive note, with a word from Udet.
Herr Udet, jetzt glauben Sie sicher, ich werde nie ein richtiger Flieger werden.
Diesmal hast du Pech gehabt. Aber wenn es auch mal schief geht, Jugend muss wagen.